On the night two men were found shot inside Stanfield Hall, the killer didn't run, he didn't hide, he simply walked out, closed the door behind him, and went back to his normal life. And when they finally caught him, he acted like the real crime was accusing him. Before we go deeper into this story, if you enjoy true crime cases like this, you can subscribe to support the channel, it really helps more stories like this reach you. Now, what makes this case even more disturbing is that James Rush didn't look like a killer at all, at least not at first. James Blomfield Rush was born in 1800 in rural England, into a life that never fully gave him stability, because from the very beginning there was confusion around his identity. He was born illegitimately to Mary Bloomfield and later taken into the household of John Rush, the man who raised him as a stepfather, and although he was eventually accepted into a farming life. Those early questions about belonging never really left him as he grew older and began forming his own view of the world. As a child he attended school in Suffolk, where teachers described him as intelligent but restless, someone who understood lessons quickly but often challenged authority in ways that made discipline difficult. And that pattern would follow him into adulthood where education faded and agriculture became his main path. By the time he reached his mid-20s, Rush had fully committed himself to farming, working land in Norfolk and surrounding areas, building a reputation as someone who understood business and land management. And in 1825 he married Susanna and settled into a more structured life in Woodalling, managing farms and acting as a steward for estates linked to the Preston family. Which placed him in a position of trust but also in constant proximity to land disputes, contracts, and financial pressure that would slowly shape his future decisions. As the years passed, Rush expanded his responsibilities, leasing multiple farms and increasing his financial exposure, and on the surface it appeared like success, because he was active, productive, and socially integrated. But underneath that appearance there were growing tensions, because agriculture in that period was unstable, harvests were inconsistent, costs were rising, and debts began to accumulate in ways that were not immediately visible to outsiders. At the same time, Rush's personal reputation began to shift in local gossip, not yet criminal, but controversial, with rumors about relationships, moral behavior, and disputes that suggested his private life was more chaotic than his public image allowed people to see. During this same period, a major conflict developed around land ownership, especially involving Stanfield Hall, a large estate that became central to Rush's financial and personal frustrations, because ownership disputes, lease disagreements, and competing claims over property created an environment of constant legal pressure, and Rush increasingly found himself caught between landlords, contracts, and debts that he struggled to balance, which slowly pushed him into more aggressive financial strategies and questionable decisions that would later become important in court. By the 1840s, his situation had worsened significantly. He was heavily mortgaged, financially stretched, and dependent on land arrangements that were becoming harder to maintain. While at home his personal life also began to collapse after the death of his wife Susanna in 1845, leaving him responsible for a large household with multiple children and no stable emotional structure. And this combination of financial pressure and personal loss created a turning point in his behavior, because from that moment onward, people close to him began noticing increased secrecy, stress, and a growing sense that he was always calculating something in the background. Around this time, he employed a governess named Emily Sanford, who would later become one of the most important witnesses in the entire case, because her presence inside the household revealed another layer of Rush's private life, including manipulation, emotional control, and a relationship dynamic that would later result in scandal when she became pregnant, adding further instability to an already collapsing household situation. And this incident damaged whatever remaining trust existed around him in the local community. At the same time, tensions over Stanfield Hall intensified further, especially as competing claims and legal disputes created a situation where Rush felt increasingly trapped, financially and socially. And rather than resolving the issues through legal or financial recovery, his behavior became more desperate, more secretive, and more focused on control, particularly over documents, ownership claims, and anything that could influence the outcome of the estate dispute, which later became a critical element in the prosecution's case against him. By late 1848, the situation had reached a breaking point, debts were overwhelming, legal pressure was increasing, and Rush was surrounded by conflicts on multiple sides. And it was during this period that events began to align toward one of the most shocking crimes in Victorian England, because inside Stanfield Hall, plans were forming that would soon result in violence, although at the time, very few people could have predicted how far things were about to go. On the night of November 28, 1848, Isaac Jeremy Preston and his son were inside Stanfield Hall when they were both shot and killed in a sudden attack that also left Mrs. Preston injured along with a maid who survived and later became a key witness, and in the aftermath of the shooting, confusion spread rapidly because the attacker had already left the scene before authorities arrived. And there were no immediate signs of forced entry or clear identification of how the killer had managed to enter and exit so quickly. What made the situation even more disturbing was the calmness that followed, because instead of disappearing or fleeing far away, the suspect behavior described around Rush suggested a level of normalcy that did not match the severity of the crime. And within a short time, he was arrested the following day as suspicion quickly concentrated around him due to financial motive, property disputes, and witness testimony that began connecting him directly to the scene of the crime. After the arrest of James Blomfield Rush, the entire case began to shift from a shocking crime into something far more complex, because what investigators were now dealing with was not just a violent incident inside Stanfield Hall, but a carefully built life that seemed to hide contradictions at every level, and as soon as questioning began, Rush did not behave like a man broken by accusation. Instead he presented himself with calm confidence, as if he believed the situation would eventually resolve in his favor. From the very beginning of his detention, Rush insisted on speaking for himself, rejecting the idea that he needed legal representation in the traditional sense, and choosing instead to conduct his own defense. A decision that surprised even experienced observers, because in cases involving murder, especially multiple victims, self-representation was usually seen as a disadvantage, yet Rush appeared convinced that his understanding of law, property, and contracts would be enough to overturn any accusations against him. As news of the murders spread across Norfolk and beyond, public reaction intensified quickly, because Stanfield Hall was not an isolated or unknown location, it was tied to respected families, land disputes, and long-standing financial tensions. Which meant the case was not viewed as a random act of violence, but as something deeply connected to wealth, ownership, and power struggles within rural society. And this context immediately made Rush a figure of extreme public interest and suspicion. Meanwhile, investigators began gathering testimonies from those who had been inside or near the property, and it was during this phase that Emily Sanford became especially important. Because her account did not just describe the events leading up to the crime, but also revealed patterns of behavior inside Rush's household that suggested manipulation, secrecy, and emotional control, particularly in relation to her pregnancy, which added a deeply personal and scandalous layer to the case that the public found difficult to ignore. At the same time, Eliza Chasney, the maid who survived the attack despite being injured, provided direct eyewitness testimony about the night of the murders, and her statements became one of the strongest pieces of evidence used by the prosecution. Because she described confusion, sudden violence, and the presence of a man she identified as Rush during the aftermath, which helped establish a direct link between him and the crime scene at a critical moment in the investigation. As these testimonies accumulated, Rush attempted to challenge them during his own defense, carefully questioning timelines, motives, and inconsistencies, and for a brief moment he appeared confident in his ability to control the courtroom narrative. Because he spoke with detail about land agreements, financial obligations, and property rights, trying to frame the entire situation as a dispute driven by misunderstanding and financial pressure rather than intentional violence. However, the prosecution gradually built a stronger case by connecting multiple layers of evidence, including financial records, disputed documents, and patterns of behavior that suggested premeditation rather than impulsive action. And as each piece was introduced, the image of Rush as a simple tenant farmer began to break down, replaced by a more complicated portrait of someone deeply entangled in debt, conflict, and long-standing disputes over Stanfield Hall and surrounding estates. One of the most damaging elements of the case was the allegation of forged documents, because investigators argued that Rush had attempted to manipulate property claims through false paperwork, which suggested not only financial desperation but also a willingness to alter legal truth in order to secure control over land, and in the context of a murder investigation. This raised the possibility that the killings were connected to a broader attempt to resolve disputes permanently. As the trial progressed, public attention grew even more intense, with newspapers reporting daily developments, and crowds gathering outside the courthouse in Norwich, eager to hear updates on a case that combined violence, property conflict, scandal, and social reputation. And within this environment, Rush continued to represent himself, cross-examining witnesses in a manner that was often detailed but emotionally detached, which created a growing impression that he was more focused on logic than on empathy or remorse. Despite his efforts, however, key testimonies remained consistent, especially from those who had seen the aftermath of the attack, and as the timeline of events was reconstructed in court, it became increasingly difficult for the defense to explain how Rush's movements, financial pressures, and presence in the area could be separated from the sequence of events that led to the deaths inside Stanfield Hall. Outside the courtroom, public opinion was already forming strongly against him, because the combination of financial motive, personal scandal, and witness accounts created a narrative that felt increasingly difficult to dispute. And although Rush continued to argue his case with persistence, there was a growing sense that the trial was moving toward a conclusion that had already been decided in the minds of many observers. As the final arguments were presented, the prosecution emphasized premeditation, motive, and opportunity, arguing that the murders were not spontaneous but instead the result of long-developing financial pressure and property disputes. And when the defense attempted to counter these claims, Rush's explanations were viewed as overly technical and insufficient to address the emotional weight and consistency of the evidence presented against him. Eventually, after consideration, the jury delivered a guilty verdict, and the courtroom atmosphere shifted immediately, because the decision confirmed what many had already suspected: that James Blomfield Rush was responsible for the murders at Stanfield Hall, and despite his earlier confidence, the legal system had now fully aligned against him, leaving him exposed to the final stage of judgment. Following the verdict, sentencing was delivered without delay, and Rush was condemned to death by hanging, a punishment that reflected both the severity of the crime and the public pressure surrounding the case. And as he was removed from the courtroom, the image that remained was not of a defeated man, but of someone who continued to appear controlled, almost detached, as if even in that moment he still believed his story was not entirely finished. After the sentencing of James Blomfield Rush, the case did not simply end in the courtroom, because in reality the execution of judgment was only the beginning of a wider public reaction that spread across England, turning what had been a local murder trial into a national point of discussion, where newspapers, commentators, and ordinary citizens all tried to make sense of how a respected farmer could be connected to such a brutal and carefully executed crime inside Stanfield Hall. As Rush was transferred into custody awaiting execution, accounts from prison officials described him as unusually composed, not showing the emotional breakdown that many expected from someone facing death. Instead, he remained controlled in his speech, measured in his responses, and consistent in his belief that his version of events had not been fully understood, which only deepened public fascination. Because the contrast between his calm demeanor and the violent nature of the crime created a psychological tension that people could not easily explain. Inside the prison environment, Rush reportedly spent much of his time writing and organizing his thoughts, continuing the same pattern he had shown during the trial where he preferred structured reasoning over emotional reflection. And even as the date of execution approached, he maintained his position that the legal interpretation of the events had been flawed, insisting that financial disputes, property disagreements, and misunderstandings had been exaggerated into a narrative of deliberate murder. However, outside his personal perspective, the evidence presented during the trial continued to dominate public understanding of the case, particularly the testimonies of Emily Sanford and Eliza Chastney, whose accounts were repeatedly referenced in newspapers and public discussions, because they provided direct human perspectives on Rush's behavior, relationships, and presence during critical moments, reinforcing the prosecution's claim that the events at Stanfield Hall were not accidental or spontaneous but structured and intentional. At the same time, the broader context of Rush's life began to be examined more closely by those trying to understand what could lead to such an outcome, and attention returned to his financial struggles, his involvement in multiple farms, his growing debts, and his increasing dependence on property arrangements that were becoming harder to sustain, creating a picture of a man under long-term pressure rather than a single moment of breakdown, which suggested that the crime, if connected to him, was the result of accumulated tension rather than sudden impulse. Newspaper reports also emphasized the unusual combination of intelligence and instability in Rush's character, noting that he was not portrayed as foolish or careless in financial matters, but rather as someone who understood systems, contracts, and legal structures well enough to navigate them effectively, which made his eventual downfall even more striking because it suggested that knowledge alone had not prevented collapse, and may have even contributed to more calculated decision-making under pressure. As the execution date approached, public interest increased further, with crowds forming discussions outside legal buildings, debating whether Rush was truly guilty in the simplest sense or whether he had been driven by circumstances that blurred the line between desperation and intent. But regardless of opinion, the legal outcome remained unchanged, and the sentence of death by hanging was set to be carried out at Norwich Prison. On the day of execution, witnesses described a controlled and quiet atmosphere, where Rush appeared calm and aware of what was about to happen, showing no visible panic or emotional collapse, and instead maintaining the same composed presence that had characterized much of his behavior throughout the trial and imprisonment, which left a lasting impression on those who observed him in his final hours. There were no dramatic confessions or sudden reversals of his claims, and instead Rush maintained his position until the end, reinforcing the idea that he believed his actions and intentions had been misunderstood within the legal framework that judged him, and this consistency, whether interpreted as conviction or denial, became one of the final defining aspects of his public image. When the execution was carried out on April 21, 1849, the event marked the formal conclusion of the legal process, and his body was later buried in an unmarked grave within prison grounds. A detail that reflected the social and legal practices of the time, where executed criminals were often denied public burial recognition, further reinforcing the separation between their public crimes and private identities after death. However, even after his execution, the case of James Blomfield Rush did not fade quickly from public memory, because the combination of financial disputes, property conflicts, personal scandal, and violent outcome created a narrative that continued to be discussed long after the legal system had closed the case, especially because many of the underlying tensions that contributed to the situation, such as land ownership disputes and economic pressure on farmers, were not unique to Rush but reflected broader issues within rural England at the time. Over time, historians and writers examining the case began to highlight the complexity of his life, pointing out that he existed at the intersection of ambition and instability, where efforts to maintain social standing and financial security were constantly challenged by external pressures, and while none of this excused the crimes for which he was convicted, it added layers of interpretation that made the case more than just a simple story of guilt and punishment. In the final reflection of his life, Rush remains a figure defined by contradiction, a man who was seen as capable and intelligent yet deeply entangled in disputes that escalated beyond control. Someone who operated within legal and social systems but ultimately became trapped by the consequences of those same systems, leaving behind a case that continues to be studied as an example of how financial pressure, personal relationships, and legal conflict can converge into irreversible outcomes. And even today, the story of Stanfield Hall is still remembered not only for the violence that occurred inside its walls, but also for the unsettling question it leaves behind about how closely a respectable public image can exist alongside a hidden private collapse, and how quickly those two worlds can break apart when pressure reaches its limit. The story of James Blomfield Rush does not end with the drop of the trapdoor or the silence that followed his execution, because even after his death, the questions surrounding his life continue to echo through conversations, newspapers, and private discussions among those who followed the case closely, as people tried to understand how a man who once appeared respectable, intelligent, and well-established in rural society could become central to one of the most shocking double murders of his time. What made the case linger in public memory was not only the violence of the events at Stanfield Hall, but the slow and complicated buildup that preceded it, because Rush's life had been filled with financial pressure, property disputes, personal scandals, and shifting reputations, all of which created a sense that his downfall was not the result of a single moment, but the accumulation of many smaller decisions and tensions that gradually closed in around him until there was no simple way out left. Even the trial itself continued to be discussed long after it ended, especially because Rush had chosen to defend himself, speaking directly in court, challenging witnesses, and attempting to control the narrative through logic and detail rather than emotion, a strategy that fascinated observers but ultimately failed to overcome the weight of testimony and evidence presented against him, leaving behind the impression of a man who believed he could outthink a system that was already fully aligned against him. For many who later studied the case, Emily Sanford's testimony remained one of the most significant elements, not only because of what she described inside Rush's household, but because it revealed a private environment that contrasted sharply with his public image, suggesting a deeper instability beneath the surface of his professional and social identity. While Eliza Chastney's account anchored the physical reality of the crime itself, confirming details that made denial increasingly difficult as the trial progressed. In the broader historical context, the case of James Blomfield Rush also reflected the fragile nature of rural financial life in 19th-century England, where land ownership, farming success, and social reputation were closely connected, and where failure in one area could quickly affect all others, creating pressure that did not always appear visible until it reached a breaking point, as it did in Rush's situation when debt, dispute, and personal crisis converged. Today, his story is often remembered not just as a murder case, but as a cautionary example of how ambition, financial strain, and unresolved conflict can interact in ways that gradually reshape a person's choices and decisions, until those choices lead to consequences far beyond what anyone around them initially expected or understood. And before you go, if you enjoyed this story and want more detailed true crime cases like this one, you can subscribe to support the channel. It helps more content like this reach you. And let me know in the comments what you think truly pushed James Rush toward his final decision. Was it desperation, control, or something far more calculated beneath the surface?